a concise history of the First Crusade. This video podcast is a collaboration between Flashpoint History and the Ancient History Guy, two excellent sources dedicated to making history accessible, interesting, and perhaps a little snarky. It should be noted that the time period that was leading up to Antioch, Stephen of Blois would write to his lovely wife about how great the crusade was going. At one point, he even mentioned how his fellow knights were thinking about making him leader, because as he would put it, he was just such a swell guy. Now during the siege of Antioch, this abruptly changed. He lost faith in the cause, and instead of becoming leader, he instead abandoned his fellow knights and started to march back to his beloved France. If deserting the cause, breaking your vows of pilgrimage, and being an all-around deluded schmuck wasn't bad enough, as he was making his way back, he came into contact with some Byzantine relief troops who were coming in with supplies and told them, "Don't bother, the crusade is over and only dead men remain." The Byzantine took him for his word and marched back, leaving the Crusaders to their fate. As can be imagined, when the still living Crusaders heard of the Byzantine leaving them, they felt betrayed and abandoned, and this would cause considerable strain on their relations. I know what you're thinking. You're wondering what happened to poor Stephen and all this. Don't worry, he made it back to France, safe and sound. Come on, he deserved it. After all, he was such a swell guy. Back in Antioch, the crusade began to bog down as the crusade leaders began to quarrel with one another. Amongst other things, they couldn't decide about what to do next, who should be in charge of the city, or whether or not the city should be given back to the Byzantine. And just to compound matters, supplies were running low. Disease, some say it was the plague, had set in, and one of the victims was Bishop Adhemar. To put this all into perspective, the bishop was the adhesive glue of the crusade leadership. He was the leveling force that kept the bloated egos of the crusade leaders in line. Eventually, it was the common soldier who began to grow discontent and demanded that the crusade continue, which was slowly initiated. In December of 1098, the nearby city of Ma'arat al-Numan was taken. The built-up tension and anger of the Latin Knights was unleashed on the population, resulting in a horrifying massive slaughter. Some Crusaders, it was said, desperate for food, turned to cannibalism. But they stood by their vows, kinda. They made it a point to kill and eat only the Saracen. In January of 1099, the Crusade army finally left Antioch under Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon. Bohemond of Taranto, being ever the crafty man, was left back in charge of the city and quickly turned it into his own private territory, declaring himself prince, and thus the Principality of Antioch was created. Raymond and Godfrey led the Crusade south. Many cities along the way either surrendered, paid tribute, or simply let the Latin host pass. By early June, they arrived at Jaffa and then turned inland toward their goal. The holy city was finally within reach. Now, it should be mentioned that part of the reason for their success was that the Fatimid Caliphate considered the Seljuk Turk the greater enemy. The two states had been waging war on one another for decades. The year prior to the Crusade arrival at Jerusalem, the Fatimid had launched an offensive and managed to capture the city from the Seljuk. Now, surprisingly, it wasn't until the Crusaders were on their very doorstep of this recently acquired holy city, brandishing weapons, if you please, that the Fatimid considered them a major threat. Prior to this, there were even overtures of a possible alliance between these two against the Seljuk. Now the Fatimid would have to quickly rethink their foreign policy and come up with a plan B. Ancient History Guy, I know you're just itching to tell us how things went once they got to Jerusalem.
On the 7th of June, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Of the estimated 5,000 knights who took part in this crusade, only about 1,500 remained. The original number of foot soldiers had also dropped, from 30,000 to just 12,000. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar Abdul, had already expelled most of the Christians from the city, making the situation even more difficult for the besieging Crusaders. The Crusaders finally besieged the Holy City, with Godfrey and Raymond besieging both the north and western walls, respectively. Prior to their arrival, the surrounding woodland area of Jerusalem had been cleared of anything that would have been of use to the Crusader army. This would prove to have had a drastic effect on the Crusaders' sieging capabilities, as there was no wood to make any sort of siege weapons. As with Antioch, the Crusaders found out that a relief Fatimid army was on its way, making the capture of Jerusalem all the more urgent. The Crusaders therefore attempted to storm the city. However, without any siege equipment, this attack was destined to fail. A few days before arriving at Jerusalem, the Crusaders had captured the port of Jaffa. Coincidentally, after the failed assault on the city, 2 supply galleys arrived at the port. The galleys were soon commandeered by the Crusaders, who carried the vessels overland and later used the wood from these ships to build some siege weapons. As well as this, quite by chance, a foraging party of Crusaders found over 400 readily prepared pieces of timber. The Crusaders now had enough timber to build 2 50-foot high siege towers. Finally, the Crusaders were ready to assault the city. On the night of the 13th of June, the Crusaders launched their main assault on the city. The tower led by Raymond was soon pelted with flaming arrows and pots of oil, and as a result quickly went up in flames. Godfrey cautiously moved his tower away from the heavily guarded section of the wall, and after 2 hours finally arrived at a weak point in the enemy's defences. Godfrey was among the first to scale the tower and enter the city. With this, the defenders gave up their positions and the city fell to the Crusaders.
For the next several days, the Crusaders brought forth an unprecedented frenzy of carnage. Man, woman, child, soldier, civilian, it didn't matter. It was a slaughter that resulted in knee-deep blood throughout the city. The chroniclers, who supposedly witnessed this event, said that 70,000 people alone took refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They were all wiped out. Now for the Crusaders, the fall of Jerusalem happened just in the nick of time. Al-Afdal, who was the Grand Vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, not exactly happy with the attack on his city, mind you, had assembled a relief army in Egypt and had marched it across the Sinai into the Levant. But it wasn't until early August that he arrived at the city of Ascalon on the coast near Jerusalem. If he had managed to catch the Crusaders while they were still in the process of besieging the city, the First Crusade might have ended very differently. However, the city was taken at this point, and on hearing about this approaching army, Godfrey of Bouillon and his fellow council opted to take the fight to the Fatimid. Ancient history guy, why don't you bring this battle home?
Assembling his army at the harbour city of Ascalon, Al-Afdal commanded as many as 20,000 troops, consisting of Turks, Arabs, Persians, Armenians, Kurds, and Ethiopians. The precise number of Crusaders is unknown, but is estimated to be around 1,200 knights and 9,000 infantry. Al-Afdal camped in the plain of Al-Majdal in a valley outside Ascalon, preparing to continue on to Jerusalem and besiege the Crusaders there, apparently unaware that the Crusaders had already left to meet him. On the 11th of August, the Crusaders stumbled upon a large concentration of oxen, sheep, camels, and goats. After asking the prisoners what purpose these animals served, it was revealed the animals were there to encourage the Crusaders to forage, making it easier for the Fatimids to attack. Instead of doing this, the Crusaders gathered the animals, who, kicking up dust, made the Crusader army appear far larger than it really was. Early in the morning, Crusader scouts reported the location of the Fatimid camp, and the army marched towards it. The Crusaders wasted no time upon arriving, getting into battle formation, with Godfrey leading the left wing and Raymond on the right. The Crusaders formed 2 lines, with the first line being made up of infantry and the second line consisting of what remained of the Crusader cavalry. The Fatimid army was still drowsy from the early wake-up call and slowly stumbled into battle formations. Not wasting any time, the Crusader army attacked the disorganized Fatimids. Unable to form up in time, the Fatimids were soon losing ground fast. A few units managed to break through the Crusader lines, however they were soon cut off and routed. With the battle going poorly, Al-Afdal and his forces panicked and rushed into Ascalon, hiding behind the walls, leaving the Crusaders victorious on the battlefield, as well as looting the Fatimid camp for many treasures that had been left behind.
With this victory at Ascalon, the First Crusade finally came to a close, at least according to the history books. The Crusaders had a foothold in the Middle East, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, and many knights, with their vows now fulfilled, went back to Europe. Many people argue that the main reasons for the Crusaders' success was a combination of sheer determination, that is, they just simply wanted it more, and the divided Islamic world that failed to mount a cohesive response. But the Islamic world would not stay fractured for long. In time, it would unite under a new champion. Eventually, the Muslims would have a chance to fight back at the Crusaders with a holy war of their own. But that's just going to have to be an amazing story for another time. For now, however, let us bring this episode on the First Crusade to a close. Oh, wait a minute, I got one last thing. Stephen of Blois, as I had mentioned, did make it back to France after throwing the First Crusade under the bus. When his powerful wife, again the daughter of William the Conqueror, found out what he did, she confronted him. And then she made him do the whole pilgrimage all over again.